So welcome back, everyone, to now a new series, which is a long time in coming, a series on Pirkei Avos, otherwise known as Pirkei Avot, otherwise known as chapters of the fathers, ethics of the fathers. Literally, Pirkei would mean like chapters or sections. In this case, I think it just refers to that it's broken up into various teachings. Avos means fathers, and right off the bat, we can ask, why is this tractate, this section called Avos, the fathers? So we really have to take a step back just to even understand what the question is. What is Pirkei Avos? Where are we getting it from? So the Torah has two parts to it. It has a written section, a written tradition, and the oral tradition. The written tradition is the Tanakh, so the 5 books of the Torah, the Nevi'im, the prophets, the Kesuvim, the writings, which is like the Megillahs and Tehillim, Psalms, and within the oral Torah is now much of it no longer oral, but actually was written down over the millennia. And much of it was recorded, especially the law portions, in what we call the Mishna, about close to 2,000 years ago now, a little less. But and the Mishna is basically all the laws of the Torah. It doesn't all fit in the written Torah. It would be as big as a library to get it all in. So the Mishna elaborates on that. The Mishna is a recording of much of the oral tradition of Jewish law. Most of the Mishnah is just that. It's just laws. There's a section on the laws of brachos, and there's a sections on all the different agricultural laws, and there's sections on all the various laws of marriage and divorce, and there are sections on the laws of damages, torts, property law, and then laws that are more related to the temple, the laws of the offerings of the temple, the laws of ritual purity, all the laws can be found in the Mishnah, at least in brief, and then they're elaborated more in the Talmud. Avos is part of the Mishnah. It's part of this oral tradition recorded and collected in the Mishnah, but it's unique. It differs from all the other tractates. All the tractates are very much focused on the law, and Avos focuses more on character. We wouldn't necessarily say that these are laws, but these are guidance in how a person should comport themselves in terms of what we call midos, our character traits, musar, guidance, and these are collected here in Tractate Avos. So why is it called Avos? So for this class, Avos happens to have like 1.5 million commentaries. So how do you prepare a class on Pirkei Avos? Literally, if you go on Sefaria, which is a great website that's full of commentaries, and you click on a Mishnah in Avos, and then you get like the side menu comes up, you have like 25, 30 commentaries, much more than if you were looking into most other things. So how do you prepare a class on Avos? So I guess one option is to go through all of those commentaries and try to just pull from here and there, but that's not what I was going to do. So what my intention for this class is to mainly use one commentary, but that it's not really using one commentary, because we're going to be using the commentary of the Midrash Shmuel. The Midrash Shmuel was written by Reb Shmuel de Uzida, who was a 16th century Kabbalist and Rosh Yeshiva, head of a yeshiva in Tzfat. Don't worry, this work is not really Kabbalistic. So we're not learning Kabbalah, even though he was a Kabbalist. He was a student of the Arizal and of the Arizal's prime student, Reb Chaim Vital. So he definitely lived in that Tzfas Kabbalah era, but his commentary on Avos is not Kabbalistic. And he wrote a very long commentary, and it's long because he anthologizes other commentaries there. So that's what I mean it's choosing mainly one, but it's not really one because he quotes from others. And then he also shares his own ideas. So we are primarily going to be quoting from Midrash Shmuel and the various commentaries that he brings. And he poses this question in his introduction: why is the tractate of Pirkei Avos called Avos, which means fathers? So he offers three possible answers. The first one, he says, I found the following answer written. It's not his own answer. He says that Avos, at least the first chapter, as we'll see, discusses also the tradition of Torah. And in the very first chapter, it first introduces the general tradition from Sinai down to the sages of the Mishna. And each Mishna actually in the first chapter is, and this rabbi received it from the previous rabbi and he said this. And then this rabbi received it from that rabbi and he said this. So it all has the tradition of the Torah being passed down from generation to generation. And therefore, it's called Avos. It's called fathers, meaning, I suppose, he doesn't really explain more than that, but that it's the tradition, the one generation to the next generation being passed on. Well, it wasn't necessarily one's father passing on the tradition, but it represents the Misora, the tradition being passed down, which can be expressed as Avos, fathers, families, parents, etc. That's one explanation. His second explanation, he says, and I want to suggest, he says, that because Avos is full of spiritual guidance, life guidance, musar, and what he calls Chasidut, not what we think of as like Hasidish, but the word Chasid means pious, piety, and it's guidance really. And a person who guides their friend, who guides another person, it's as if they gave birth to them. So he brings, for an example, we have that when Abraham is told by God, when Abraham is commanded to leave the land of where he grew up and go to the land of Canaan. So it says that he went and he took with him all the souls that he had made in Haran, which is where he was coming from. And the commentaries discuss, Rashi quotes it, I guess, from the Talmud, really, the Midrash. What does it mean he made people, right? How was he making people? So he was building them up. He was teaching them all the people that he had taught the ways of God to. He had taught he had brought his message to. So when we provide guidance to people, so we are in a way fathering them. And therefore, all the teachers, all the sages that appear in this tractate are like Avos to us. They're like fathers to us because they are providing guidance to us. That is answer number 2. And answer number 3 that he says, I heard another suggestion, and that is that the word Avos actually can also be used in a different context. It means fathers, but we actually find in other contexts that it means categories. So for example, there are 39 types of work that are prohibited on Shabbos, on the Sabbath, and those are called the Avos Melachos, the categories of work. We also have it in the laws of damages. We have Avos Nezikin. There's 4 areas of damages that are discussed in the tractate that deals with that. So Avos can just mean, just like fathers are like the heads, of a generation. So Avos just means like the head categories, the headings in a certain sense. And he says that within the teachings of the tractate of Avos, you will find all the guidance that's out there, basically. Meaning anything that you will encounter in any other book that provides valid and true spiritual guidance, character guidance, it falls under the categories that are already discussed in Avos. I shouldn't say everything is there, but all the categories are there. These are like these are all the headings for all types of character development. They're all here in this tractate. And that's why it's called Avos, not because of fathers, but because Avos just means the categories that of character development. So again, three suggestions for why this tractate is called Avos. Number one, because it discusses the tradition of one generation to the next generation. Number two, because the sages are in a certain sense fathering us in that they are building us up with their teachings. And number three, it doesn't mean father, it just means categories. It provides all the categories of character development and growth, and anything that you might encounter is going to fall under one of these avos, one of these categories that's found in this tractate. Okay, now I did send out a source sheet, but the source sheet is basically comprised of the first three Mishnas in Avos. So either you can bring your own, you can use my source sheet. If you didn't get it on the email, I'll just put it in the chat if you'd like. And hopefully you'll be able to get it from there if you want it. So we're ready to learn the very first Mishnah. The three Mishnayos, that's plural for Mishnah. Mishnah is each chapter, well, not chapter, there's chapters, but each section within the chapters, each paragraph is a Mishnah. So we're going to learn the first three Mishnahs. And in a certain way, these are, as you might expect at the beginning of any book, they are introductory, but they are going to provide very important foundations for our approach to learning this tractate and really our approach to life. These are sort of the building blocks upon which we approach life and we approach Torah. So the first Mishnah says as follows, and I don't always read the Hebrew. I think in this case, I'm going to read and translate the Hebrew. Moshe kibel Torah miSinai. Moses received the Torah from Sinai, umisara liYehoshua, and he transmitted it to Yehoshua, to Joshua, his prime disciple, v'Yoshua liZikanim, and Joshua to the elders, uZikanim liNeviim, and the elders to the prophets, uNeviim misaruha la'anshe knesses hagadola, and the Neviim, the prophets, they transmitted it to the men of the Great Assembly. The men of the Great Assembly was a group of 120 sages that lived basically at the very end of the first temple, throughout the exile in Babylonia and Persia, and at the beginning of the second temple. They were the leaders of the Jewish people. They actually enacted much of post-temple practice because they were post the first temple, which carries on to today. And so this is the tradition of Torah. Moshe received it from Sinai. He transmitted it to Joshua to the elders to the prophets to the men of the Great Assembly. And then it says, Haim amru shlosha devarim. They said three things. Of course, they said much more than three things. But these were three things that they said that were either very important, perhaps they said them very often, or perhaps they said them in relation to what we're talking about now, this tradition. So when we explain, we'll try to understand it. But what did they say? So number one, havu misunim badin, be patient in judgment or in justice. Number two, v'ha'amidu talmidim harbe, raise up, establish many students. V'asu siag la'Torah, and make a fence around the Torah. Those are the three things that they taught. Be patient in judgment, establish many students, and make a fence around the Torah. Okay, so I want to actually just open the floor if anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment. The question doesn't have to be what does it mean to make a fence around the Torah. We'll explain what things mean, but if you just have it could be a text question, why does it say like this? Or if anybody has a thought, or I can just keep going. So feel free if anybody wants to jump in now. Nope. Okay. All right. So let's pose some questions. there are many places that we could discuss the tradition of the Torah. Why is this tractate starting with the tradition? Maybe, this isn't the first tractate in the Mishnah. The first tractate is brachos, the laws of blessings, and of course there's a question why that's first, but that's the first tractate. Maybe it would have made sense to put this right there. When you start learning Mishnah from the very beginning, that could be where we teach about the tradition of the Torah. Why is this tractate beginning with the tradition? Moshe received the Torah from Sinai, gave it to Yehoshua, Joshua, he gave it, and so on and so on. Why do we start, of all tractates, this tractate with discussing the tradition? So the answer is actually very, very profound. This is the answer of Rabbi Ovadia Mibartanura, who's one of the great commentaries on the Mishnah, and the Midrash Shmuel quotes him. So that means he lived before the Midrash Shmuel. Midrash Shmuel is 16th century. So he predates him. I'm not sure exactly when he lived. I think maybe 15th century. So Rabbi Ovadia Mibartanura says as follows. This tractate, like we've said, is very different than other tractates. The other tractates are Jewish law, the laws of marriage, the laws of agriculture, the laws of damages, the laws of the temple, of the offerings, the sacrifice. All the tractates deal with Jewish law of the Mishnah, except for this one. This one is not laws. It is what we call musar. It's guidance for behavior, but it's not what we would call law. So one might have thought that this book of guidance of how to live one's life is like any other book that you might pick up. You go into the bookstore, if there's still such thing. You go on Amazon, and I guess there are still bookstores around. You go into or at least there's libraries. You go into the library, you pick out a self-help book, how to be a greater person, right? And you start reading. So there's the books that you can find in the library or on Amazon, and then there's Pirkei Avos. There's different places you could go for guidance, but they're both, this is the guidance of some rabbis that lived 2,000 years ago, and this is the guidance of someone, who, a university professor or whatever. And what's the difference, right? So Avos starts off and says, no, there's a big difference. The difference is that this is actually part of the tradition from Sinai, even though this is not law per se, but it's still part of the tradition. This still emanates from God. This is still part of our oral tradition of the Torah. It's very different than a book that you might pick up in the library. And that's why we start off here. The laws, of course, the Jewish law emanates from Sinai, and we can appreciate that more easily. There's a system of law that God gave, but ethical behavior, how to be nice to your friend, how to be patient, all these things that we'll touch on, that is maybe just the rabbis giving their piece, what they thought, right? No, starts off, this is the tradition. Moshe received the Torah at Sinai, transmitted to Yehoshua to the elders, and then we go to each rabbi and he received it from him and he would say this, and he received it from him. And what they're each kind of giving the parts that they focused on, but all of this was part of the tradition of Torah going back to Sinai. So it's very important to start off with that idea. It's a big world out there, right? And there's lots of opinions and there are many influences, and the outlooks of people change, if not daily, but every couple of years, the ethics and the morals are just, this was good last year, but it's not good this year. Last year, this was no good. Now it is good. Everything is constantly in flux of what is okay and what is not okay in the eyes of society. And where do we go for what's ethical and moral? How do we know? Where do we rely on whatever the politicians are saying, or whatever the Hollywood actors are saying, or whatever the media is saying. Where do we go? How do we know what's right and what's wrong? How are we to know? Or some people are, excuse me for using a strong word, but arrogant enough to think that they know on their own, right? I can decide on my own what is right and what is wrong. But in this religion, we teach humility, that we don't necessarily know on our own, but it's okay because we don't have to, because we have somewhere that we can turn to for guidance, and that is to the Torah. And it guides us in every area of life, and certainly in what is ethical and what is moral, and how a person should comport themselves. And that's really what is being brought out here, that these ideas come from Sinai. They are part of the transmission from the creator of the universe. Now, it's noteworthy that it says Moshe received the Torah from, could have said God, right? From God at Sinai, but it doesn't say that. It says from Sinai. Why does it say that? So some understand it doesn't want to say from God because there might be an implication that God kind of gave over all of his wisdom to Moshe. And that's not the case. God's wisdom is beyond, any human capability, even that of the great Moses, to be able to receive all of God's wisdom. So therefore it said from Sinai, it's kind of like, it didn't want to just say from God. That would have an implication that he got everything from him. That's one idea. But Rav Hirsch says something very powerful, something else. And that is that we actually had a whole series about a year and a half ago or so, what happened at Sinai, right? And we learned about the great events of Sinai and how important they are in our tradition as a foundation of our faith in the truth, the integrity of Torah and the tradition, and of Moshe as a prophet. And so when we say Sinai is a big word. It means the events of Sinai. It means this amazing event in our history that is such a foundation. So when we say Moshe received the Torah from Sinai, we don't just mean the place. He got it on this mountain, right? No, Sinai is an idea. It's an event. It's a part of it's a foundation of our faith. Moshe got the Torah at this tremendous revelation at Sinai. That's really what we're saying here. That's why we choose to focus on, he got the Torah from Sinai, from this great revelation, which is an integral part of our faith, in the faith that we have in our tradition. Now, if you're paying really close attention, so the language of the Mishnah changes as it goes. So it starts that Moshe received the Torah from Sinai, and he transmitted it to Joshua. Why doesn't it say that either? It could have said Moshe received the Torah from Sinai and Joshua received the Torah from Moshe and the next one received it from him. It doesn't say. It says Moshe received it and he transmitted it to Joshua. Or it could have said God transmitted the Torah to Moshe and Moshe transmitted it to Joshua. Doesn't say that either. It switches. It says Moshe received it and then he transmitted it. So why does it flip sort of the perspective from receiving to transmitting? So the Midrash Shmuel suggests the following, and it's kind of what I was just touching on before. God's wisdom is beyond human comprehension. The Torah is a manifestation of God's will and God's wisdom. But no way does it touch on everything, right? It's a drop in the bucket. It's a drop in the sea in terms of God's knowledge and wisdom. But we have a little bit of it. So to say that God transmitted the Torah to Moshe would almost imply that he gave over all of that wisdom. But the language of receiving is that, like, Moshe received basically as much as a human could receive. That's what it means. To receive, he was a receptacle. A receptacle can hold as much as it can hold until it's full. So it says Moshe received as much as is humanly possible for one to receive wisdom from God. And then he transmitted all of that to Joshua, to Yehoshua, because it's humanly possible for that to be transmitted. And so the tradition that that Joshua received from Moshe was intact, and it was full. It was all that Moshe was able to receive from God, which is all that human beings are capable of receiving. And Yehoshua then passed that on to the elders of the following generation. And the elders, usually the elders is understood to mean like the period of the Shoftim, the judges who followed Yehoshua, and they are followed by the prophets, beginning with Shmuel, Samuel, and the prophets that follow him. So Yehoshua then gives it to, the elders give it to the prophets, and the prophets, again, span many generations, and then they transmit it still fully intact, the full transmission to the men of the Great Assembly. And the men of the Great Assembly live at the time of the destruction of the first temple. And it's at that point where we are in exile and things are a little bit more shaky. After that, we no longer use the word transmitted. We're then going in the following Mishnah, we're going to go back to the word receiving, because we're not going to be receiving it as intact as it was. There begins to be disputes and debates that will crop up in the Mishnah and the Talmud later. So the men of the Great Assembly is kind of the last generation that it was transmitted fully intact. And now we still have a strong tradition, but we no longer are comfortable using the word transmitted. We now use the word received as much as they were capable of receiving given the circumstances. Okay, so that just explains that language, that switch from receiving to transmitting, and also, but it brings us back to the theme of the Mishnah, which is the integrity, the just bringing out the idea of the Masorah, the tradition from Sinai to each generation. And it says that they said three things. They said three things. The three things were: be patient in justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. So what are these? Why are they choosing these three things of all things? So the Midrash Shmuel explains that this Mishnah is speaking about the tradition of Torah. These are three rules or recommendations for preserving the tradition. Number one, be patient in judgment. A rabbi, a sage receives a question. He has to answer it. If he just answers it quickly without thinking it through, and he answers it wrong, well, that is going to be a perversion of the tradition of Torah. It's messed up, and it could set it on a path that now he's going to be quoted as saying that. And there's a precedent now, right? Just like in secular law, there's so much based on precedent. So that's actually in Jewish law as well. The Talmud has, it brings rulings. That's how we arrive at this rabbi ruled this way. And we have, volumes and volumes of responsum where somebody posed a question to one of the great rabbis, and there's, rabbis nowadays are still writing them, and they don't just, sometimes they'll give their answer orally, but sometimes they'll write it out and they'll give their entire logic behind their answer. And so, and then we refer back as, sort of as precedent for how to rule. If somebody were to answer without thinking, they can easily make an error, and that will corrupt the tradition of the Torah. So number one, if we want to preserve the tradition, number one is that we have to be careful in judgment, careful in answering questions when we're asked to answer a question. Number two, it says establish many students. So this can have different explanations that would tie into this concept of preserving Torah. Number one is famously the Talmud says that one of the sages said, I don't remember which one, but he said that I learned much from my teachers, but I learned even more from my students. So there's so much to learn from our students. And in particular, if we want to preserve the integrity of our tradition, we make a statement, we say something, and then our students say, wait, but that doesn't make sense. Let's clarify it. I have a question. And then we end up with a clear and true picture. So part of preserving the tradition is actually the give and take of teachers with students that help the teachers clarify for the students. So by having many students, we can ensure the integrity of the tradition of Torah. That's number one. And number two is that in a certain way, there's all of us, but then there's like the leaders of each generation. And in a certain way, those leaders, those Torah leaders, are really the ones carrying on the tradition in its fullest sense. The ones who know the entire Torah and can clarify the most difficult questions. At the end of the day, those people, the leaders of our generation, are the ones who are leading the way in preserving and carrying on the tradition. But how do we know who those people are going to be? How do we find those leaders? So we need to have many students so that we can sort of find those great people. The more students that we have, the more people that we bring into the halls of study, the more likely will emerge some of them will emerge as leaders who will be the force in carrying on the tradition. So in carrying the tradition, we say, establish many students, because from amongst those students, the many students that we establish will emerge someone or someones who will be the primary mediums of passing on the tradition to the next generation. And then one more explanation for this, to establish our students, would be to make them self-supporting, to teach them to the point that they can go out on their own. They know enough to carry on the tradition themselves now, to be the ones who teach the next generation. This is a different explanation, not necessarily the leaders of the generation, just anyone. We should have many students who can then, and we should not just have them, but stand them up, raise them up. That was the language, to stand them up, to put them on their own 2 feet, to be able to be those links in the chain of the tradition. So I just said 3 different explanations for raising up our students. We should raise up many students to carry on the tradition. It could mean that because by having many students, the teachers will learn the most. They will learn from their students and clarify the tradition. It could mean have many students that we can find those great Torah luminaries who will be the leaders of the generation in carrying on the tradition. Or it could mean stand up many students, raise many students, meaning get them up on their own 2 feet, make them self-sufficient in their knowledge of the tradition of Torah, so that they themselves will be capable of being the links in the chain of passing it on to the next generation. And finally, the third thing that they said, and we're explaining these all in the context of preserving the tradition of Torah, is make a fence for the Torah. Make a fence for the Torah. So this, on the most simple level, is about preserving the Torah in various ways. Making a fence could mean making a fence around the laws of the Torah. So we have biblical law and we have rabbinic law. Rabbinic law, in a certain sense, is meant as a fence to protect biblical law. If we appreciate what it really means to a law of the Torah, a biblical law, that's a law directly from God, then we don't even want to get close to transgressing that. So we put fences around it. We say, don't even, if this is the biblical law, we don't even want to come to here, right? So we put a fence around it so that keeps us from even getting close to a transgression of God's will. And that preserves ultimately, there needs to be Torah practice to preserve Torah. I mean, ultimately, the purpose of all study is to come to action. That's the purpose of study. There's multiple purposes. Actually, we're going to talk about that in the next Mishnah, but that's definitely a main focus. So when we're preserving the tradition, we're not just preserving the ideas, like it's a book of ideas, but it's also about preserving the actual behavior, the acts. And to do that, we need to put fences around it to protect all the observance of all the laws of the Torah. Another explanation that he offers is that make a fence around the Torah. He understands that it can mean not necessarily like a fence, but basically a teacher should be careful how they speak in Torah. Sort of like put a fence around your mouth. Not that you shouldn't speak, but just be mindful of how we speak and how much we speak. That a teacher, there's a concept in the Talmud of like not talking too much, basically. If you talk too much, then it confuses people. Be brief, be specific. If we get too wordy, then people end up getting lost. So put a fence around the way that we speak, meaning be clear, be brief, and that way we won't lose people. So again, that would tie back into preserving Torah by being careful in how we speak when we teach others. Okay, so I think that's probably good for the first Mishnah. So the first Mishnah here is really setting us up. Like I said, it's introductory. It is, first of all, introducing the idea that the ethics, the morals, the teachings of Pirkei Avos are not just the rabbi speaking from their own mind, what they thought, but it's part of the tradition of Torah from Sinai. And in keeping with that theme of preserving the tradition, we are taught three things that we should do to preserve the tradition. Be careful in judgment, make sure we get it right, don't make the wrong precedent in Jewish law. Number two, establish many students. We gave 3 explanations for that. And finally, put a fence around the Torah, make sure we're protecting the Torah's laws. And also we said maybe protecting our words, making sure that we speak carefully when trying to teach Torah and pass on the tradition. The next Mishnah, the way I understand this Mishnah at least, is very, very fundamental and very profound. So the next Mishnah says, Shimon HaTzadik Haya Mishiare Knesses HaGedolah. Shimon the righteous was one of the last men of the Great Assembly. So he actually lived into the period of the Second Temple. He was the first high priest, the first Kohen Gadol in the Second Temple. And he served as the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, for 40 years, I believe, which was, I think, one of the longest. The Second Temple was a very tumultuous time, and they kind of just had like revolving high priests, which is a story for another time. But many of them were not very righteous. But the first one, Shimon the righteous, was righteous, and he was one of the last people on the men of the Great Assembly, this great group of 120 sages who were next in receiving the tradition. So he used to say, the world stands upon 3 things: on the Torah and on avoda, the service, and on gemilus chasadim, on acts of kindness. 3 things. So again, like I said before, he used to say 3 things. Of course, he said much more than 3 things, but these were 3 things maybe that he focused on. And these are 3 things that I think we need to say right now at the beginning of Pirkei Avos as we set out on this little journey. The world stands on 3 things. That sounds pretty important. These are the 3 things that the world stands on. They uphold the world: Torah, avoda, and service of God, and gemilus chasadim, acts of kindness. So Rabbeinu Yonah, great medieval commentary, he says that he first of all points out that there's a Mishnah at the end of this chapter, Mishna 18, which has a very similar thing. The Mishnah there says that the world is sustained by 3 things. It's used a different Hebrew word. Instead of saying omed, it stands on 3 things, it said it's sustained by 3 things. And it says 3 totally different things. It says on justice, on truth, and on peace. So it seems to be that we have an argument going on here. This one says, the Mishnah, the world stands on 3 things: Torah, service of God, and act of kindness. And there it says the world is sustained by 3 things: truth, justice, truth, and peace. So Rabbeinu Yonah says, no, they're not arguing. They're talking about 2 different things. That Mishnah at the end is talking about sort of what a society needs to, the world is sustained, society is sustained only if there's justice, truth, and peace. This is something that's more personal, and I think even more fundamental to creation and the world itself. And that is that when we say that the world stands on this, what we mean is that the world was created for this. This is the fulfillment of the purpose of the world. The world reaches its purpose through 3 things: Torah, avoda, service of God, and gemilus chasadim, acts of kindness. And this brings us back to the most fundamental question. If we're saying the world was created for this, so why was the world created? Well, for this, right? But why was the world created? So the idea that our commentators teach us, Kabbalists, but it's not really such a Kabbalistic idea. The idea is that God created the world in order to be able to have a creation, a creature to do kindness for. God wanted to do good, to do tov, to be meitiv, to do goodness for a creation. Now, what is the greatest good that any creation could experience, that God could bring into existence? The greatest good would be to be able to have experienced God, to have a closeness to God. So God could have just created a bunch of souls and said, okay, here I am, come and get it, come enjoy, come bask in the light of God, and that would have been it. It would have been much simpler, right? So why do we need all this, right? Why do we need this world? The answer is that God wanted to give the greatest good, because God wants to do good. God doesn't just settle for okay good, the greatest good. So if there's goodness that comes free, God creates souls and says, come enjoy this great good of experiencing God. Or you can have the same amazing experience, but it could be earned. Which one would be a greater experience for that creation? The one that's earned, right? You have 2 people enjoying the same thing. One earned it, one got it for free. The one who earned it will enjoy it more. So therefore, for it to be the greatest good, if God would just say, come and get it for free, that wouldn't be the greatest good. The greatest good has to be earned. So God creates a system wherein his creation that he wants to do good for will have an opportunity to earn that amazing experience of experiencing the closeness with God. So God creates this whole system that we know as our world. And our goal, our mission in this world is to try to achieve that closeness with God. So how do we achieve that? How do we take advantage of our time in this world so that when we return our souls to God, they can bask in that glow to the greatest extent, having earned the right to do so? So there's three things primarily that we focus on: Torah, service of God, and acts of kindness. Why? Because in order to create the greatest closeness with God, we need to make ourselves similar to him. We need to be like God-like. Again, closeness is what we're trying to experience with God. That's the greatest good. But the greatest closeness occurs between beings that are similar. So we need to use our time to make ourselves similar to God. So there's different ways that we make ourselves similar. One is in our minds, in our mindset, in our perspective, developing our minds to align our perspective with that of God's. How do we do that? Torah study. By studying Torah, we're learning how God looks at the world, what God wants with the world. We are then becoming more godlike. Number one. Number three, we'll skip ahead for a second, acts of kindness. Again, acts of kindness are emulating God. That's making ourselves similar to God. And then there's service of God. Service of God is actually doing acts that bring us close to God. So in the temple times, it would be to bring an offering. An offering is called a karban. The word karban means to draw close. And nowadays, tefillah, prayer. What experience is there that brings a greater closeness than prayer? That's actually what we call avoda nowadays, service of God, services, right? You go to services. So that's avoda, that's service of God. That draws us close. But it's not just that. All the mitzvos, all the commandments actually draw us close to God. So all of these together bring us close to God and help us fulfill our destiny and our purpose in creation. And so that's what it means that the world stands on three things. It means the world was created for these three things, for a person to be able to engage in these three things, thereby drawing closer to God. It's also interesting, one of the commentaries that Tiferes Yisrael, or Yisrael Lifshitz, points out that these three things also touch on three different relationships. There is our relationship with ourselves. Torah, when we study Torah, we're really working on ourselves. It's really just us. When we do service of God, avoda, so that's between us and God. And when we do acts of kindness, that's between us and others. So we have three different kinds of relationships that we're working on here. Ourselves, us and ourselves, between us and ourselves, between us and God, and between us and each other and our fellow people. And that all these things together combine to help a person reach their perfected state, make them the most similar, the most godlike, which is fulfilling our purpose in creation. So it's really very profound, this Mishnah, and very important as an introduction to how we're to comport ourselves. So we start, the first Mishnah is the origins of Torah, the origins of our tradition, and preserving that tradition. The second Mishnah is really dealing with our purpose and mission in this world. Which brings us to the third Mishnah. The third Mishnah says as follows: Antignos ish socho kibel mishimon hatzadik. Antignos, the man of Socho, accepted it from Shimon the righteous. So as I mentioned earlier, we now switch. Now that we're out of the man of the great assembly, Shimon the righteous was from the man of the great assembly. We no longer use the word that they transmitted it. Now we're back to receiving, because now there's a bit of a drop off. We've been through the exile, it's Second Temple period, it's tumultuous, and there's now sort of a bit of a diminishing of Torah knowledge throughout the generations. So here it uses the word, he accepted whatever he was able to receive. Hu haya omer, he used to say, Al tiyu ka'avadim hamishamshin es harav al manas lekabel pras. Don't be like servants who serve their master for the sake of receiving reward. Ella, rather, havu ka'avadim hamishamshin es harav shelo al manas lekabel pras. But rather be like servants who serve their God, not in order to receive reward. V'mora shamayim aleichem, and then it adds a line that the fear of heaven should be upon you. So this Mishnah says we don't serve God for the sake of reward, but rather serve God not for the sake of reward. And by the way, one more thing, it throws in the fear of heaven should be, or the awe of heaven should be upon us. So the commentaries are bothered because this just seems to go against many verses in the Torah. Throughout the Torah, it says in numerous places, for example, in the Ten Commandments, it says, I think that's about honoring parents, I think. It says you should honor your parents in order that you'll have long days and in order that it should be good for you. And it says this about numerous other mitzvos, commandments, sometimes just in general, you should guard the mitzvahs in order that it should be good for you. So it seems that we have explicit verses saying, keep the mitzvos. Why? In order that it should be good for you. So isn't that serving for the sake of reward? So how is this sage contradicting explicit verses in the Torah? So the Abarbanel asked this question, and he suggests that there's two different types of rewards. There's rewards in this world, and there are rewards in the next world. When the Torah says that you should perform these mitzvahs and it will be good for you, it means it will be good for you in the next world. When Antignos, and this Mishnah says, do not serve God for the sake of reward, it means don't serve God for the sake of reward in this world. And the reason, one reason at least, that he says is because that can actually lead to many problems. Because if a person's serving God just for the sake of reward in this world, I mean, besides for that, maybe it's not the right outlook, but what if God decides for some reason that person isn't going to receive that reward? There could be different factors, right? God is the ultimate judge. Maybe God has something else in mind for that person. So a person's doing it in order that they are rewarded in this world, and then it's not coming. So what do? They say, forget about this, right? They say, I'm done with this because I did this for the reward and it's not coming. When really God has his reasons, right? So therefore, it's not a good approach. One should not serve God for the sake of reward in this world because they may not receive it and they may get upset by that. On the other hand, we won't see our reward in the world to come until we get there. So it's okay to serve God for the purpose of receiving reward in the world to come. That's how the Abarbanel explains it. The Midrash Shmuel himself says, I'm not even bothered by this question. I don't think it's a contradiction in the first place. When the Torah says, serve God, in order that you should have goodness, it's not that's God speaking from his perspective. God saying, when I give you these commandments, I want you to know I'm not doing it for me. I'm doing this for you. You should do this for your own good. If we connect it to the previous Mishnah, we mean like your ultimate good, right? This is going to give you that ultimate good in the world to come. But that's God talking. God saying, perform the mitzvahs of the Torah so that you can experience the ultimate good. But that doesn't mean that that's why we should do it from our perspective. From our perspective, we should just serve God out of pure love, not for the purpose of any reward, but rather just out of pure love of God. In a certain way, though, the the reward, so to speak, we're not talking about, going on to the world to come and finding like, 70 virgins or whatever other religions say, right? That's not what we imagine for the world to come. Right? Once some rabbi heard, for the Jews, it's 70 smorgasbords, right? So no, that's not what the world to come, obviously we're talking about spiritual things. We can't really find the right words to describe it, but it's experiencing God in some way, in a spiritual way. It's not just taking the physical things from this world and having them in abundance in the next world. That's not what it is. So in a certain sense, we say, you shouldn't serve God with the intention of receiving reward, but the reward is the experience of the relationship with God that we have developed in this world anyways. So it's really the perspective can be, it's almost like the same thing. I'm not doing it for reward, so to speak, but I am doing it because I want to have a relationship with God. Just to end off with one idea, the last words of the Mishnah closes and it says that you should have the fear of heaven upon you. So why does it throw that in? So it could be, one explanation is because we're saying you should serve God out of love, right? That's the whole idea. Don't do it for reward, do it out of love of God. Now, sometimes when we have this loving relationship, we become a little bit too relaxed, right? A child to a parent, let's just say children are willing to say things to their parents that they're not willing to say to other adults, right? Because they all love each other and things become a little bit casual sometimes. But the Mishnah is saying, serve God out of love, but that doesn't mean that you don't have to always keep in mind this awe and reverence of God. That would be maybe what I would say is the simple explanation. The Midrash Shmuel quotes from Rabbi Yitzchak Cairo one other explanation, a few others, but one that I want to share, and that is that he wants to read the Mishnah when it says that the fear of God, the fear of heaven should be upon you. It means you should know that God fears for you. You should know that God fears for you. God doesn't want any bad to befall us. God loves his children. And this brings it back again to the previous Mishnah. God put us in this world only for our good. He put us in this world because he loves us, because he wants to do kindness to his creations. And this Mishnah tells us, don't serve God just for the purpose of reward. Serve God out of love and know that God is fearful for you. God is fearful for us, for what's to become of us. God cares about us very, very deeply, and he only wants the best for us. So there we have a little introduction to Pirkei Avos, which is just, I think, an introduction to life, really. We'll stop there.